This is a very ancient feast in the life of the church. Early on, long before many of the other feasts were fixed, the Feast of the Presentation was already being celebrated widely throughout the church. And that may at first glance appear rather strange. I mean, it doesn't appear to be all that big an event in the Gospels. After all, every Jewish parent offered their firstborn son to the Lord at the temple, and then offered the sacrifice which, as it were, brought the child back from God. So why all this fuss in Luke's Gospel? Well, I suggest to you that what Luke is doing is giving us the first taste of the culmination of the whole Gospel right at the start. Because after all, where, from the point of view of the Gospel writers, where is all this heading in the life of Jesus? It's all heading to that moment when, having constantly poured himself out in loving obedience to the will of the Father and in service to his brothers and sisters, Jesus obediently follows out that pattern, even to embracing death, even death on a cross. It's about Jesus offering himself to the Father in obedience. And what is this gospel passage about? It's about Jesus being offered to God in the temple in obedience to the law, to the expressed will of God in the Mosaic covenant. That what Luke's gospel sees so clearly is, from beginning to end, this is one story about one reality. And that reality is, from the beginning to the end of his life, literally from being an infant to the last gasp on the cross, Jesus gives himself totally to the Father in accord with the will of the Father. So that in fact, what the early Christians realized so clearly was, what we're celebrating at the event of the Presentation is the beginning of the whole mission of Jesus' life. It's interesting that if you look at the Gospels, remembering that there's never been a kind of a book like a Gospel before, one of the questions that had to face the early Christians was, how do you write one? You couldn't very well say, well, there's lots of models for writing a Gospel around. Take so-and-so's Gospel or so-and-so's Gospel. There's never been one before. So how do you write a Gospel? And one of the interesting questions it raises is, where do you start? Now, Mark's Gospel starts with Jesus' beginning of his public ministry. It starts with his baptism by John. Matthew and Luke say, oh, no. You really have to start by going back to his birth. And even before that, we have to tell you about his ancestry, about who begot who begot who begot who begot who finally begets Joseph or Mary, and therefore Jesus. John pushes it even further. John says, no, if you're going to go back before where Mark starts, you have to go all the way back, in the beginning. And we start with the very creation. Well, one of the interesting questions is, when does Jesus' mission start? Once again, Mark, and indeed often Matthew and John, seem to suggest the mission starts when Jesus is baptized by John. I think Luke says, no, the mission starts the moment he's brought to the temple. After all, the prophet Malachi has said, when you least expect it, the Lord will show up in the temple. Well, who would have expected on this particular morning that when a carpenter from Nazareth and his wife arrived with their first baby, that the Lord was entering his temple in glory? Simeon spots it, Anna spots it, but presumably most people at Jerusalem never noticed it. God will come to his temple when you least expect it. And when God comes to his temple, God comes as one who is offering himself utterly in obedience to the will of the Father. And that mission is the mission of the whole of Jesus' life. So from Luke's perspective, everything Jesus says, everything Jesus does throughout the Gospel is really the same thing. It's an act of self-offering to God in obedience to the Father's will, from the Presentation right through to the Lord's passion and death. Now, there are a lot of things that we could consider in that theme, but the one that I want to take particularly is the one that I suggested a moment ago that Malachi sounded so long ago. The Lord will come to the temple when you least expect him. Well, I suggest to you that one could say the same thing about the temple of God, figuratively the church, today. When does the Lord come to his church? When you least expect him. That the Lord enters the life of the church just at the moment when the church may be least looking for the Lord. Just at the point when the church may be most battered, most discouraged, most disheartened, when the church seems to be losing everything, that might be the moment when the Lord shows up in his temple, because he comes when you least expect him. These have not been good days for the Church of the United States. You might have noticed. Here in Boston, it would be rather hard not to notice that these have been bad days in the life of the church. At a moment when there seem to be fewer and fewer people seeking religious life and ordination, at a moment when the church seems racked with scandal, at a moment when we're hearing about dioceses going bankrupt, at that moment, as parishes are closing, as the church seems to be in crisis, might it be that at exactly that moment, when you were least expecting it, that the Lord is showing up in his temple? Sometimes when the Lord shows up, he shows up not because everything's going wonderfully well, but because everything is going, it would appear, very badly indeed. I suggest to you that these are not simply moments of crisis in the life of the church. They're moments of enormous possible growth in the life of the church, because it forces us to get back to what really matters. When I was growing up, before the Second Vatican Council, indeed, some of you may think before the Council of Trent, but when I was growing up before the Second Vatican Council, there seemed to be the glory days of Roman Catholicism in the United States. Parishes were getting founded all over the place. Parishes were building schools. New dioceses were coming into existence. It looked like the church was thriving. People were falling out the windows in seminaries. You couldn't bolt the doors of novitiates with people coming in. It looked like the church was thriving. And maybe in some ways it was. But in some very important ways, maybe it wasn't. Is the life of the church to be measured in bricks and mortar? Is the life of the church to be measured in balanced account books? Is the life of the church to be measured in how big the annual collections are? Is the life of the church to be measured in how many people are getting ordained, or how many people are taking religious vows? Or is the life of the church to be measured in how many people are offering themselves to the Father in obedience to the Father's will? If the latter, then who's to say that these are not the glory days of the life of the church? You know, last evening I had the opportunity, as I do every year, once during the year, to speak to a program here at BC called the Emerging Leaders Program. A group of immensely bright, immensely gifted young men and women, as quite honestly, and this is not to flatter any of you who are here, who among the students of BC is not immensely bright and immensely gifted. Bright, energetic young men and women. And in the course of, after my presentation, and we were into conversation and questions afterwards, one of the students said to me, "You're talking about service as leadership as service, and service as love of our neighbors. It's very hard, you know, to love the neighbor sometimes. How do you keep doing that?" And of course I said to them, if I knew, I would be a very great saint instead of just being a professor of theology. But I suggested to him one possible thing that he should keep in mind. It's something that I've had occasion to mention on other opportunities here at St. Mary's. It's a statement from Montaigne, the great French essayist of the second part of the 16th century. Montaigne, at the end of his life, Montaigne says lots of incredibly wise things, but he says one thing that I think is breathtakingly wise. It is, Montaigne says, that he's changed his standard for looking at people around him as he got older. He says, when I was a young man, I used to judge people by what they did. Now that I've grown older, I judge people by how much it has cost them not to have done worse. I think that is almost inexpressibly wise. Think not about what the person has done. Think about how much effort, given their situation, their gifts, their viewpoints, their background, how much it has cost them to do even the little that they may have done. How much has it cost them not to do worse? And I suggested to this young man who asked the question last evening that if you took Montaigne's standard, you might find as you go through life that we are surrounded by heroic and courageous effort, that we are surrounded by a moral heroism every day of our lives that we don't even notice, because we're not noticing how much it has cost people to do what they have been able to do. We begin by saying, well, why didn't they do better? What an amazing thing that they did anything. We live surrounded by moral heroism. I find myself knocked over by the level of moral effort, imagination, courage that I bump into day after day after day in people here at BC, in people all around us. And I suggest to you that that's where you may find the Lord coming to his temple. And we don't notice it because we're expecting something very big and very wonderful, trumpets blaring and great new initiatives and wonderful things happening and all sorts of seething success. We may have been people who would have overlooked the arrival of a carpenter and his wife with their baby in the temple. It would never have struck us that this was the glory of the Lord coming home to Jerusalem. Well, I suggest to you that the glory of the Lord comes home to us day after day after day in ways that we may never suspect or notice. And it may happen most precisely when it looks like it happens least. Precisely when it looks like the game is lost, it may turn out that the victory has been won. The Lord shows up in ways you don't expect. That's why I suggest to you that this feast is so important. It's important because it's the revelation not only of what the Lord's life is about, but what the life of the people of God is about. It's about endless offering of self in loving obedience to the Father, from the beginning of one's life to the end. And the Lord comes home to his temple when you don't notice it.